Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today for a book haul for the month of November. I have more books than I have in recent book hauls, but just kind of a little bit crazy, but we'll talk about that. Obviously, we have also decked the halls. We have our Christmas tree, the stockings, a whole lot of stuff out. You might be thinking it's too early. It's not even Thanksgiving, to which I say it is never too early. Just FYI, Joel is in the kitchen working on Thanksgiving. So if you hear noise, it's probably that. Or Jamie is circling like a shark because it's approaching her dinner time. But let's dive into the actual book haul. I'm going to divide this into two parts. So I've been seeking out a lot of books for my Pulitzer Prize project, and I got a bunch of them from my local used bookstore, and we're going to open with those, and then we'll transition to the books that are kind of outside of the Pulitzer Prize project. The first one that I got for the Pulitzer Prize project is The Killer Angels by Michael Shaara, the classic novel of the Civil War. This edition is published by Random House. This won the 1975 Pulitzer Prize for fiction and was surprisingly popular when I was working at a Borders in northern New Jersey during the 2000s, both with older white men and with teachers who made it part of the assigned summer reading for a local high school. And all of that only really ever made sense when I later found out that Michael Shaara and his son Jeffrey, who wrote books in the same vein as The Killer Angels, are both from northern New Jersey. The more you know, right? This is a novel about the Battle of Gettysburg. I believe it is set across 4 days, including the Battle of Gettysburg, shifting perspectives from various historical figures on both sides of the Civil War. And it should be an interesting book to get to as part of my project. It opens with a map. If you follow along, you know I love a book with a map. And in book hauls, I like to do a little bit from the opening of the book. So let's do that right now. There's a note from the reader, and there's a map and a foreword. So let's find chapter 1. Monday, June 29th, 1863. Mine eyes have seen the glory. Chapter 1, The Spy. He rode into the dark of the woods and dismounted. He crawled upward on his belly over cool rocks out into the sunlight, and suddenly he was in the open and could see for miles. And there was the whole vast army below him, filling the valley like a smoking river. That is the opening of The Killer Angels by Michael Shaara, the first book that I got for my Pulitzer Prize project. It's a nice, handsome hardcover edition of it as well, which is really nice. I had kind of decided that I want to have a copy of every book that has won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, since I'm doing this project where I'm trying to read all of the books that have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So in order to do that, I'm trying to lean on used books so they'll be affordable. Like, this was actually cheap. And because it's at my used bookstore where I trade stuff in, I didn't even have to spend any money on it at all. And the same is true for Breathing Lessons by Ann Tyler. I have actually read this book before. It's the 1989 winner of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I read it at some point in my early 20s, and I distinctly remember absolutely hating it. It's about an elderly couple on a road trip to a funeral, and they just fight nonstop. They just bicker, and it's awful. I remember really not liking it at all. They just fight for the entire book. Critics praise it as a story about unmet expectations and life and love. So there's a chance I might appreciate this more now that I'm older. Maybe I just wasn't primed to appreciate a story like that at such a young age. We'll find out when I get around to revisiting it. Here is a blurb from Michiko Kakutani's review in her New York Times review. It says, Miss Tyler is able to examine again the conflict felt by nearly all of her characters between domesticity and freedom, between heredity and independence. In addition, she is able, with her usual grace and magnanimity, to chronicle the ever-shifting covenants made by parents and children, husbands and wives, and in doing so to depict both the losses and redemptions wrought by the passage of time. So again, this is something I'll be revisiting. Will I like it more now that I'm older, or will I still hate it? Only time will tell. This edition is published by Knopf, and let's do the opening of Breathing Lessons. Chapter 1. Maggie and Ira Moran had to go to a funeral in Deer Lick, Pennsylvania. Maggie's girlhood friend had lost her husband. Deer Lick lay on a narrow county road some 90 miles north of Baltimore, and the funeral was scheduled for 10:30 Saturday morning, so Ira figured they should start around 8. This made him grumpy. He was not an early morning kind of man. And I sympathize with Ira right there because I'm not an early morning kind of man either. But that's Breathing Lessons by Ann Tyler. The next one is Foreign Affairs by Alison Lurie. The 1985 winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction is somewhat interesting because while I don't think it's necessarily gone out of print or fully just disappeared, it seems like it has virtually no cultural footprint at all. It follows 4 American academics in England. If you're wondering if the title is a pun, you are correct because these characters are both on foreign land and some of them are having affairs. I don't have huge expectations for this book, but it's on my list at some point, so we'll get there eventually. This edition is published by Random House, and let's do the opening. Chapter 1. On a cold, blowy February day, a woman is boarding the 10 a.m. flight to London, followed by an invisible dog. The woman's name is Virginia Minor. She is 54 years old, small, plain, and unmarried. The sort of person that no one ever notices, though she is an Ivy League college professor who has published several books and has a well-established reputation in the expanding field of children's literature. That is the opening of Foreign Affairs by Alison Lurie. We have 2 more Pulitzer books. The next one is another really good find in hardcover. This edition of The Fixer by Bernard Malamud is in pretty decent condition, and it was $5. And again, because I had trade-ins, I didn't spend any money on it at all. This is even, I think, from the 3rd printing of the book, which was the same year it was published in 1966. So this is a special book because it won the National Book Award and the 1967 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. It is inspired by the real-life case of Menachem Mendel Bilis, who was accused of ritual murder in Kiev in 1911. He was eventually acquitted, sparking international criticism of anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire. And interestingly, the descendants of Mendel Bilis also accused Bernard Malamud of plagiarism. So this will be an interesting deep dive for the Pulitzer Prize Project when I do get around to it at some point. Let's do the opening of the book. This edition is published by FSG. And here we go. Chapter 1. From the small crossed window of his room above the stable in the brickyard, Yakov Bach saw people in their long overcoats running somewhere early that morning, everybody in the same direction. And we'll leave it at that. That is the beginning of The Fixer by Bernard Malamud. The final Pulitzer book in this book haul, before we get into all of the others, is Tinkers by Paul Harding. Again, found this really lovely hardcover edition of it, published by William Heinemann. And this is a particularly interesting Pulitzer book because it was probably the biggest surprise of the last at least 25 years. Basically, no one had even really heard of this book when it won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. The New York Times hadn't reviewed it, nothing like that. So it just came out of nowhere to win the Pulitzer Prize. It does feel like it's sort of fading into the unknown again, but that just kind of makes it even more interesting to get to because it's a pretty recent book that people feel like they don't know much about. It is about a father and a son, as the father is sort of on his deathbed, and I have heard good things about it, but it just seems like this is sort of a forgotten book as well. Chapter 1. George Washington Crosby began to hallucinate 8 days before he died. From the rented hospital bed placed in the middle of his own living room, he saw insects running in and out of imaginary cracks in the ceiling plaster. That is Tinkers by Paul Harding. So those are the 5 books that I got for my Pulitzer Prize project. Again, I feel like just at some point I would like to have a copy of every book that has won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and these are all ones that I have yet to cover as part of that project. The only one I have read before is Breathing Lessons by Ann Tyler, and it's one that I feel like I should reread and just give it another chance. Maybe just the fact that I was in my early 20s is why I didn't like it. But let's get to the other books that are not part of the Pulitzer Prize project. The first one is actually, it's kind of a twofer. I got 2 books by Claire Keegan, Foster and Small Things Like These. I had already read Small Things Like These. I read it in January. It was released later last year, and I really loved it. It was one of my favorite books, or will be one of my favorite books from this year. And I saw a used copy online, so I ordered it, so I will have it, and it happened to arrive at about the same time that Foster came out, and I have actually already read this one. It's, I think, 94 pages, so I did it in a single evening, and I already talked about it, but I will be covering it again in my monthly wrap-up, so stay tuned for that. But I'm really happy to have both of these. They will fit together nicely on my shelves. Both of them are published by Grove Press, and let's do openings for both of them. Let's start with Foster. Here we go. Chapter 1. Early on a Sunday after Mass in Clonigal, my father, instead of taking me home, drives deep into Wexford towards the coast where my mother's people came from. It is a hot day, bright with patches of shade and greenish, sudden light along the road. And we'll leave it at that for Foster. Here is the opening of Small Things Like These. In October, there were yellow trees. Then the clocks went back the hour, and the long November winds came in and blew and stripped the trees bare. In the town of New Ross, chimneys threw out smoke, which fell away and drifted off in hairy, drawn-out strings before dispersing along the quays, and soon the river barrow, dark as stout, swelled up with rain. And if you are unfamiliar, Foster was actually published, I would think, in 2010 in the UK, and it was only just published in the US. It follows a girl who is sent to stay with her aunt for the summer, and the healthy relationship she develops with her aunt and uncle. And ultimately it's about love and kindness, as is Small Things Like These, which is set in 1985 and follows a man who works for a coal company and discovers something at the local convent that causes a moral conundrum for him as well. Both are beautiful books if you have not read them, and I would highly recommend them. Then there's another twofer, because my neighbors a while ago recommended a mystery author named Ngaio Marsh, and I've been kind of keeping my eyes out for the first book in the series. And not only did my local used bookstore have the first book in the series, A Man Lay Dead, they also had the second one, Enter a Murderer. So I figured I would just pick them up and get them, because I trust their recommendation, and they were both $1 each. So can't really go wrong with that. They are described as sort of like Agatha Christie-esque stories, but possibly even better. A Man Lay Dead. It seemed like fun to the guests at a high society house party, but when one of them turned up stone dead, a pall of fear settled over the gilded group. The time had come for one of Sir Hubert's guests to take over, the famous Inspector Allen of Scotland Yard. And in Enter a Murderer, Roderick Allen goes to see a show, and someone in the cast is murdered. And we will leave it at that and just do a little bit from the opening. Chapter 1 of A Man Lay Dead. Nigel Bathgate, in the language of his own gossip column, was definitely intrigued about his weekend at Frantock. And the opening of Enter a Murderer is... On May 25th, Arthur Serbonadier, whose real name was Arthur Symes, went to visit his uncle, Jacob Saint, whose real name was Jacob Symes. That's the opening of both of those. Really looking forward to trying them. I've had bad luck with mysteries and thrillers, but again, I feel like I trust the recommendation of my neighbors. I tend to favor sort of classic whodunits, and these seem like they would be in that vein. And I wanted to try. I'm one of those people who likes to do things in order, so I really wanted to wait until I could get the first book in the series and start from there. So that's what I'm doing. And then I recently did a video on the best short novels or novellas, and I'll put a link to that down below if you'd like to check it out. One of the ones that I talked about wanting to read is The Yellow Wallpaper, and which is technically the length of a short story, but I feel like because it is often talked about on its own, it kind of fit the subject. It's by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I found this Dover edition of it at my local used bookstore. It has some other stories in it as well. Obviously, it is really tiny, so it should be pretty doable to fit this in at some point. I've just heard a lot of really good things about it, so I'm happy to have it and be able to get to it whenever I have the time. Here is the opening of The Yellow Wallpaper. It is very seldom that mere ordinary people like John and myself secure ancestral halls for the summer. A colonial mansion, a hereditary estate, I would say a haunted house, and reach the height of romantic felicity, but that would be asking too much of fate. That's the opening of The Yellow Wallpaper and other stories by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a classic. And again, I'll have the link to the full video about the best short novels or novellas down below. Cruising right along, there are only 2 books left. We have The Town of Babylon by Alejandro Varela. This was a finalist for the National Book Award. It did not win. It lost to The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty, but I am really looking forward to reading this book very much. It is published by Astra House, and I'm just going to read the blurb from the publisher website. In this contemporary debut novel, an intimate portrait of queer, racial, and class identity, Andre, a gay Latinx professor, returns to his suburban hometown in the wake of his husband's infidelity. There he finds himself with no excuse not to attend his 20-year high school reunion and hesitantly begins to reconnect with people he used to call friends. Over the next few weeks, while caring for his aging parents and navigating the neighborhood where he grew up, Andre falls into old habits with friends he thought he had left behind. Before long, he unexpectedly becomes entangled with his first love and is forced to tend to past wounds. I've heard really great things about this from people who have already picked it up, and I'm not a huge fan of the cover, being honest, but the subject matter immediately grabbed my attention, and my library didn't have a copy. It wasn't on any of my subscription apps, so I decided to get a copy from Montana Book Company, which is the same place where I got this Protect Trans Kids t-shirt that I am wearing. And I'm really looking forward to this book. I don't know if I'll fit it in before the end of the year, but I would like to if I can. Here is the opening of The Town of Babylon. Chapter 1 is called Sidewalks. The alumni newsletter was sitting on my bed atop a small pyramid of neatly folded towels. It had a January postmark, but the glossy pamphlet remained crisp, no doubt due to my mother's care. On the back, among a scattershot of exclamatory text, it read, "Mark your calendars, class of 97. Reunion this July. Check St. Iggy's Facebook page for updates." After mulling it over for a couple of days, I visited St. Ignatius's alumni page this afternoon. And that is the opening of The Town of Babylon by Alejandro Varela. Again, I've heard a lot of really great things about this. It was a finalist for the National Book Award. Didn't win, but I'm still really looking forward to getting to it. And the final book for my November book haul is The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida by Shehan Karunatilaka. This is the book that won the Booker Prize for 2022. And it was something that I had been very interested in reading, but it was not going to be released in the United States until, I can't remember if it was late October or early November. I want to say early November. I pre-ordered it with Montana Book Company, and when it released, they sent it to me. So here it is. This follows a Sri Lankan photographer in the 1980s who has 1 week or 7 moons to solve the mystery of his own death and convince his friends to expose the brutality of the Sri Lankan Civil War with the aid of photos that are on a camera underneath his bed. It also has LGBTQ elements in it. I believe it deals with closet homophobia and a closeted gay man and homophobia as well. I'm really looking forward to it. Shehan Karunatilaka's speech at the Booker Prize ceremony was really great. I've heard so many good things about it. It was kind of fun to follow the Booker this year because it feels like people really didn't know about The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida when the long list was announced. When the long list was announced, it felt like people were really just excited about small things like these, which kind of surprised everyone by making it on the long list and then ultimately the short list, because it was the smallest book ever to make it. But by the time the shortlist was announced, it felt like excitement had really shifted over to The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida. And a lot of people had read it because it was on the long list and just become big fans of it. And then they were happy to see it on the shortlist. And they were even happier when it ended up winning. And I'm very happy that I have a copy here. And I would love to get it. Again, I don't think it's going to happen this year because we're so close to the end of the year and there are some things I need to finish up before we get to the close of December. But I do want to read it hopefully sometime soon. Here is the opening. The first part is called First Moon, and the first chapter opens. It's called Answers. You wake up with the answer to the question that everyone asks. The answer is yes, and the answer is just like here, but worse. That's all the insight you'll ever get, so you might as well go back to sleep. You were born without a heartbeat and kept alive in an incubator, and even as a fetus out of water, you knew what the Buddhists sat under trees to discover. It is better not to be reborn, better to never bother. Should have followed your gut and croaked in the box you were born into, but you didn't. And that's the opening of The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida by Shehan Karunatilaka. I am very pleased with the 12 books that I brought into my library in the month of November. I'd love to hear what you think of any of them, if you've read them, in the comment section down below. If you have recommendations based on any of these, again, let me know in the comment section down below. This is a larger book haul than some of the recent ones that I've had, but again, the majority of them came from my local used bookstore, so they were kind of cheap, and I didn't actually spend money on them because I traded them in. And I'm still excited about all of these books. I feel like there aren't any that I'm even unsure I would like to read, and many of them are, almost half of them are for my Pulitzer Prize project. So I'm bound to read them at some point anyway, and I really want to have copies of each of those in my library. So we will leave it at that for now. And I will just say thank you for your time. As always, it is greatly appreciated, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.